whatever you think about yourself as a learner, whatever you think about yourself as like, whether you're good at school, whether you're bad at school, whether you're good at some subjects and not other subjects, just realize that that impression is based on a fairly narrow set of prior experiences. And that, I'm not trying to make some bold claim that like everyone's just as smart as everyone else. We could all be Albert Einstein. I'm saying something I think rather obvious and more commonsensical, that just you have a fairly limited set of experiences that you're drawing this on. And so it makes sense to maybe sample some experiences that are outside of the range of things you've done before. Try projects that are different than what you've done before. Try to learn things in a way that maybe you haven't considered before.
Thank you for coming on, Scott. I really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, it's great. I'm glad to be able to talk with you.
I love the title of your book, Ultralearning. What does this word mean to you?
Well, so it's kind of funny. First of all, just the word ultralearning sounds kind of arrogant. Like it feels weird saying it. Like, oh, I do ultralearning. But it started because I did this project called the MIT Challenge, where I was trying to teach myself MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum using their free material, and maybe we can get into that. And I wrote a little guest post for my friend's blog, who's also a big author, Cal Newport. And, the common practice is that you write the article and then someone else, in traditional publishing often writes the headline. And so his sort of title for this article was Experiments in Ultralearning. He put a hyphen between them. And so he kind of came up with this he kind of came up with this name for this kind of project. And I sort of kind of stole that and renamed it. But the idea in the book was to focus on this sort of intersection between two things that doesn't happen that often. One of them was self-education. So people who teach themselves things, or they do it in like a particularly self-directed way. So to contrast that, like, obviously going to medical school is a lot of work, but it's a very formal program. You just enroll and you do what you tell them to do and you try to keep your head above water. Whereas the ultralearning, the self-directed learning, is where it's sort of like, I want to learn this. And then you just try to go out and you do it. And then the second thing is I wanted to focus on people who were like very, very keen on how do I optimize and get the most out of the learning process. So to contrast that with the person who's like, well, I'm going to learn a language, so let's like throw open Duolingo and like play with it for like 15 minutes while I'm, sitting on the bus every day. These were people who are like, okay, let's break it down and try to learn this in the most efficient way possible. So I kind of somewhat immodestly make myself an example of this in the book, but I think there's lots of other people who have done more impressive things than I've done. And I wanted to bring together their stories to show people what was possible, because I think we live in a world where we know everyone who's gone to college, we know everyone who's gone to school, we know everyone who's done things the kind of traditional way, but most of us have never met anyone who has just learned something difficult completely on their own. And when they have, and it's usually over this extended period of time, it's very hard to see how they did it. So if someone just told you, oh yeah, I just learned how to play guitar, I just figured it out, it's kind of like, well, how would I possibly replicate that? Maybe you've been doing it for 10 years or something. And so I wanted this book to be a kind of beacon to show people, look, there's this other way of doing things. And if you understand the principles of learning, which I spend most of the book actually getting into, then this kind of learning is not quite so daunting. That the idea of learning something you're interested in, I think becomes more of an option.
I really like it because we're living in such a fast-paced environment. We constantly need to be learning new things in order to stay competitive in the job market. So how would you compare, let's say, ultra-learning projects to a traditional degree or the traditional educational system?
Well, so I think the definition that I gave doesn't necessarily make the case that, there's something very particular, like all ultra-learning projects are going to be different from traditional education in a particular way. Because I think if you're doing self-directed and kind of aggressive learning, there's lots of different ways that could manifest. I mean, it really depends on the individual. But one of the things that I think is a kind of contrast is that when you are taking on the project yourself, so you've decided, I want to go out and I want to learn this so that I can do this, and you are guiding it, you can often optimize your sort of learning path in a lot of ways that is very difficult to do within a traditional university environment. So I'll give an example. I got a traditional undergrad in business. And if I look back at that experience where I spent a number of years in school studying business concepts, I probably got a lot of value out of like maybe 20% of those courses. And so it was probably something that like, if I were just like, I want to know enough business to run my own business, or I want to be able to like know enough about accounting or finance or this kind of thing, probably could have done it in a very different way and still gotten most of what I wanted to get out of it. Similarly, if you're, let's say, learning a language, often what they'll do is you'll sit you down and then you're like memorizing conjugation tables and things like this. But maybe what you want to do is just you want to be able to have like conversations with someone on your upcoming trip. Well, in that way, again, you can probably modify the projects. You can get to a point where you can have those conversations much faster than you would in a traditional program. And this isn't something, sometimes they make it sound like it's magic, but it's just sort of obvious. If you were going on a road trip and you were going between New York and let's say Miami, but you had to like, because of the way that the system worked, you had to go to San Francisco first. It was just going to take you a lot longer. And so this idea that you can tailor what you're learning to what you actually want to get out of something. And that if you understand the learning process, you can start to say to yourself, oh, okay, this is what I need to do to get this result. And I think that kind of flexible, personalized, student-driven approach to learning is particularly valuable in an era where, maybe you're not 19 and deciding what you want to do with your life. Maybe you're, 32 and you don't like your job and you'd like to switch, but going back to school for 4 years isn't an option. And then I think this kind of thing becomes a lot more appealing.
And in the book, you describe this 9 principles, which I would love to dive into. But before that, I want to know how you went about finding and creating these principles.
Yeah, so I mean, there's 9. It's not like I kind of picked those because they were the ones that seemed most relevant. And the list was originally 7. I added 2, and then some of them got merged and deleted. So I'm not trying to make some kind of sense that these are the principles of all learning. But I wanted to cover some of the ideas, both from cognitive science. So some of the principles have to do with how we think, what research says about how we think and learn and remember things. So I have a principle, for instance, on retrieval, which is a very kind of narrow thing, but it's something that a lot of people miss, which is that if you want to remember something, you have to practice remembering it. You can't just look at it. But that's how most students study, is they just look at their notes over and over again, which turns out is really bad if you want to be able to actually do well on a test. Similarly, directness is another principle drawn from cognitive science, which is this idea that when we learn skills, we tend to learn them narrowly and welded to the context that we learn them in. And this has all these implications, because if your goal was to be able to use skill in context A, and you spend all your time practicing context B, you may be a lot worse at A than you think if you only spend time on practice B. So there's these cognitive science principles, but there's also a lot of principles that I think are just things that you would need to do to be successful with really any kind of self-directed learning project. So like meta learning is the first principle I have in the book. And this isn't so much a kind of principle of how the mind works, but just the fact that if you are going to structure your own progress towards learning something, you need to have a map, you need to have a plan. And a lot of students fail because they don't spend enough time building this map, and they get stuck and they get frustrated and they give up. Or experimentation, which is sort of the idea of like, how much trial and error should you be putting in, and when should you be putting in trial and error? And these things, it turns out, are really important, because if you are going to teach yourself something, sometimes you will choose a strategy that doesn't work very well and you'll have to adjust. So I tried to create this mix of practical and cognitive science-based principles so that if you read through it and you thought about any project that you'd like to undertake, you could just kind of go through them almost like a checklist of like, how does this apply here? How does this apply here? And you would probably zone in on a better than average technique just off the bat, just from thinking through those principles. Of course, there's a lot of nuance there. As you get more experience learning things, you can make a lot of fine discriminations that just principles won't apply. But I think that it's a really good starting point.
You've done a bunch of these ultra-learning projects, as you call them. You've done the MIT project. You did a drawing one, learning new languages. I think it was 3 months at a time. How do you, could you maybe tell us how you go through this process and how you apply each technique. Like, tell us a story of maybe the MIT challenge, or the one where you learned the languages, or maybe one you're doing now, so we can sort of envision these principles.
Right. So, let's start with the MIT challenge, because seems to be my most popular project. This is my first one I did. And so this was a project I did shortly after I graduated from university. I'd studied business, as I kind of already mentioned. And I don't know if you've ever felt like this, but maybe you go to school and you study something and then you think to yourself, I should have really studied this other thing instead. And so nearing the end of my degree, I kind of felt that way. I'd studied business and I'd gone into it because I was really interested in entrepreneurship. And then I realized that business school is not really that great for entrepreneurship. It's mostly teaching you how to be like a good middle manager of a company. And I wanted to be the person making things. I didn't want to just be the guy who's the business guy in a partnership. I wanted to be able to make things. And so computer science was, probably one of the best faculties for learning how to make things that, businesses, our entire, new startup economy is based around a lot of people who had CS backgrounds going in and building things. And so I was interested in that, but going back to school didn't seem super appealing to me. It was going to be another 4 years. It was going to be, I'm shelling out tuition dollars. Maybe I'm living in a dorm room. And so when I was kind of debating this internally, I found MIT had posted some of their classes online for free. So just the material from the class, they just uploaded it and like do whatever you want with it. And I did one of these classes and I thought, wow, this is actually really good. Like, it's pretty similar to if I went to an actual class. Like, it has the lecture videos, you watch those, it has assignments, it has the exams. And so my idea was, well, if you could do a class, maybe you could do an entire degree. So turns out this is not as trivial as there's a lot of like piecing together. You have to do this because MIT was never intending just like randos like me to try to do a degree online or to try to simulate a degree online, I should say. But this seemed really appealing to me. Like, I didn't care about getting another piece of paper. I just wanted to have the skills and the knowledge. And so I called this project the MIT Challenge. And originally, out of simplicity, it was just going to be focused on passing the final exams, because a lot of classes didn't have full sets of material. So if you do it like exactly the way an MIT student does, then yeah, it's impossible, just because you can't do the classroom presentations. The group projects are out of the question. But I mean, the final exams are things you can do. And, they generally test whether or not you understood the course that you just took. And so I started with that. And then later I added the programming projects, which were all like solo programming projects, because, it's being computer science and actually wanting to learn programming, that seemed important as well. And so I put together a list of 33 classes that it roughly approximates what an MIT student would do. It's the same number of credits, I guess you could say. And I started the program. And kind of my twist on this, I'm kind of saving this for last, but my sort of twist on this is that I wanted to really challenge myself. And so I wanted to see if I could do it in under a year. And so I'm not saying that everyone can do it under a year, but I think that given the kind of changes and alterations I made, it was more feasible than maybe it would have been if you were, attending a regular university, because I could just, watch classes whenever I was ready, take the exam whenever I was ready, and just sort of proceed through it at a pretty brisk pace.
I really like how you, having the tests, you sort of knew what to study and what you needed to learn. That a big problem could be when you're in university or just for traditional education, is that you learn so many different things and you don't know how you can apply these things later on in your life. That there needs to be that connection that, as you said in the beginning of the interview, with Ultralearning, you want to do this. Okay, how do I get here? But with education, it's just like more all over the place.
Well, I think that one of the challenges of traditional education is that because it's not being directed by the learner, a lot of it feels kind of pointless. Like, a lot of it feels like, well, why am I learning this? And I think if you don't know why you want to learn something, you just know that you have to, I think it does really rob you of a lot of motivation to study, and I think it also makes it harder to really internalize it at a deep level. If you've just kind of convinced yourself, oh, this is just BS, this is just something that I need to memorize to pass this test so I can get on with my life, then it's no wonder that like you're not going to do well when you get into a real situation. You're like, oh, that thing that I thought was useless, maybe I should apply to this situation. No, you're not going to do that. And I don't want to say that it's always that bad, but I can say even for myself, when I was in business school, that's how I felt about a lot of the classes. So I don't think it's just, I'm some super interested, curious learner and like other people are Philistines. I think it's just that the way traditional education often sets it up is that, all right, this is what you have to learn. And there isn't as much motivating examples or motivating ideas. Whereas I think when you're doing something that's self-directed, because you have to always keep the purpose in mind while you're choosing things, things don't feel as arbitrary. I mean, sometimes you have to learn stuff that's hard or you don't want to learn. So I don't want to give the impression that it's always easy. But I think at the same time, if you say to yourself, okay, this is why I'm learning this, then at least it's motivated and you have that reason for doing it. So I do think that this approach to learning can, at least some of the time, be more effective for that.
And I saw that you recently posted a blog post about motivation. Would you mind telling us the different ways we could get motivated, different types of motivation, right, and how they apply to learning?
Well, yeah, so I did this big deep dive into the research on motivation, and I kind of published a summary of that research. Complete Guide to Motivation is free, so anyone who wants to check it out on my website can. The idea I want to kind of leave with is not so much that like different types of motivation or even just the practical tips of how to motivate yourself, but viewing your motivation as a system. So admittedly, motivational research can be kind of complicated, and I don't blame people who feel a little bit scared off by it. But I think that if you view your motivation as a sort of product of a kind of a system that's understandable, then you can see to yourself, okay, well, why do I not feel motivated to do this? Or why am I struggling? Then you can kind of self-diagnose and sort of be like, this is the problem. It's this. This is the thing that's creating the issue. So there's a couple different things that you can think about for motivation. I think one of them is that your motivation to do something depends a lot on self-efficacy. So this is a concept by researcher Albert Bandura. And the idea here is that if you don't think you can do something, you don't think you're going to be successful doing it, even if you put in effort, it's very difficult to put in effort to do it. And I think for learning tasks, that's often the case, is that we don't see ourselves as being able to do something. And so because we don't see ourselves as being able to do it, we have a lot of difficulty summoning up the motivation to do that thing. And as you can see, this can become a little bit of a feedback loop, because if you have low motivation, you do badly on your exams, and then you convince yourself you're bad at studying, and then this becomes a process. And so I think for a lot of learners, this has really become entrenched. They've kind of convinced themselves, I'm not good at school, I'm not smart, I'm not good at learning things. And so they find it very difficult to even, I have to do this more learning project. And so when even if I'm talking about all this learning or talking about doing MIT classes, if you're feeling like in the pit of your stomach, just this awful feeling when I'm describing this project, that's what I'm talking about, right? Is that it has become really negatively weighted for you. It's become something that you find really unpleasant. And I don't think that there's like a quick escape hatch out of this, but I do think that you can gain more self-efficacy through two ways. One is through watching and seeing people succeed at something. And I think if you watch and see people succeed, it can give you some kind of confidence that maybe I could also do that, particularly, if you view yourself as being somewhat similar to them. So in this way, like an example would be, when I'm talking about the language learning project I did, I would have never even contemplated this kind of project if I hadn't first met Benny Lewis. So he had been doing these projects where he would go to a new country and learn a language conversationally within a couple months. And so if I hadn't heard of people doing this, it would have just been like, oh, that's just impossible. It just takes years to learn a language to the point where you can actually use it. And so I think books like mine, which have a lot of examples, can at least kind of nudge you in that sort of, well, maybe that's possible. And then I think that helps. You want to shake that kind of foundation a little bit. The second thing is you want to build actual experience doing it yourself. And so I talk about that in this book, where there's a little bit of a feedback loop of, if you've done an Ultralearning project successfully, suddenly, the world opens up a little bit. You're like, oh, maybe there's these other things that I could try or attempt. And I think that if you feel really closed off, if you feel really like it's very difficult for you to do these things, then doing your own project that's a little bit different, that you're not directly in competition or comparison with others, that's something that you really, really care about on your own, can help you bootstrap some of that confidence. And so I do recommend people do these things, because I think sometimes the problem with the traditional environment is that, yeah, you're a good student in school and you get this kind of constant feedback loop that tells you you're smart and you're good at this. But if you're a middle or a below average student, you're getting the opposite. You're getting constantly a signal like you put in a lot of effort, but you still didn't do very well. And I think sometimes that's artificial. Sometimes that's just the environment you're in. Why does it matter that it took you a little bit longer to learn this subject than someone else if you learn it at the end of the day, right? And I think at the end of the day, what we want is skills in our life. And if it takes you a bit of a different approach, or it takes you a little bit longer, then that's fine, right? But I think the way that we often do things in school, I think, really exaggerates this sort of effect. So that if you weren't doing that well, it becomes really hard to motivate yourself to do those things.
Yeah, it could definitely be very demotivating having this, if you're not a very good student at school, always getting the same grades and falling into this negative feedback loop, which can then later on lead to mental barriers, saying things like, I'm too old to learn this language, or I'm not smart enough to learn this. So how do you recommend we fight against these mental barriers that we create for ourselves?
Well, I mean, I'm not really one of these people that thinks that just really motivate yourself. Like some people have that kind of like, I'm just going to write affirmations. I think that we see ourselves, more or less clearly. And so if we've had bad experiences, like the reason you feel badly about studying is not, you're not making it up. You probably had bad experiences in the past. But I think the problem is that our past experience is usually fairly narrow. So we haven't tried everything. We haven't done everything possible. We've had this narrow set of experiences. And if it was bad, then we feel negatively about it. If it was good, then we feel positively about it. But it's like this. And so for me, I think that's one of the hopes that I have with something like Ultralearning, is that if you can give someone an experience that's outside of that narrow range, maybe something that they really have a lot of value for, that they are really driven to want to learn, and they do it in a different way, maybe in a way that doesn't have some of the same cues and reinforcement that they had when they were struggling more, they might uncover, new abilities in themselves. And I don't want to make the impression that I think everyone's equal, all talent doesn't matter. I'm not trying to make that case. What I'm trying to say instead is that, maybe you had a bad experience when you were 17 and you were in high school, and now you're, your late 20s or your early 30s, and you're contemplating learning something, and you still think back to when you were 16 and doing badly in school, and that makes you feel negatively about studying. But you've changed a lot. Maybe you can be a lot more organized and a lot more systematic about tackling it. Maybe if you weren't constantly being in direct comparison with the person sitting next to you, you wouldn't feel so bad if you get a bit frustrated at first, because I find that happens. If you're learning something on your own and you're a little bit slower than someone else, that could be fine. But then you're put right next to someone else who's doing it better, and you immediately feel like crushed. And so I think self-directed learning, because you have the ability to control that environment, does benefit you. And I think if you pick something that you are really, really motivated to learn, not just something someone told you to learn, I think that also has a big difference. I know we were talking before this started about how you did a coding boot camp. I mean, the coding boot camps are hard. They're difficult. You have to learn a lot of new concepts and ideas, but it's this chunk of time where after there's a really strong incentive. I could get a good job after this. I could have a new career, which maybe wasn't a motivation you had when you were learning, chemistry in high school, where you were like, I just got to get through this. And I got 56% on the exam. That's not very good. So the situation is different and the motivation is different. And so I think for a lot of people, shifting to a new environment can give you a new exposure, which can sometimes give you a new opportunity to be better at learning. I mean, in the examples of people I covered, one of them was Benny Lewis, and he was bad at learning language when he was a school. He speaks so because he didn't in school fit with his method, and it didn't work very well for him. And it was only when he started doing it in a different way that he discovered this love of learning languages. Or Tristan de Montebello is another person I cover in the book who became really good at public speaking, top 10 in the world for an international competition. And but despite that, he did kind of badly at public speaking before that. Like he had kind of speeches where he told jokes and no one laughed and it was awkward. And I think that's natural. And I think that if you kind of, now he maybe only had a handful of experiences, and so it's very easy to learn from that. I'm maybe not that good at public speaking, but it's just because he never had an exposure to a different kind of structure, a different kind of learning methodology. So I think one of the challenges is that the more traditional education kind of holds everyone constant. So the way you learn things, the way you approach it, all has to be exactly the same. And because it all has to be exactly the same, it's really easy to be like, oh, well, this person's somewhat better than me, or this person's somewhat worse than me. And I think, again, that benefits some people, but for other people, I think it could be really demotivating.
That Tristan de Montebello example was great in the book. You actually coached him to sort of try out your principles, right?
Well, I would say that I more watched him than coached him. Like,
okay.
I was had like an advisory capacity on his project. I don't think it was the case that like I had some secret sauce that made him an excellent speaker, but rather I was gathering people who like wanted to try doing an ultra learning project, so I could kind of watch them and offer them advice. And a lot of what I think I helped people with was designing and structuring their project. Because I think that's something that, you can read through my book, and a lot of the principles of learning and stuff will I think are helpful to people. But I think one of the things that just most people don't do is they don't know how to structure and set up a goal. So they'll say sort of like, okay, in the next 6 months, I'm going to be a professional programmer. Like they don't know how to do that, right? They don't know how to think about that. And so I think that was sort of my contribution maybe to Tristan. But the truth is that he just worked really, really hard. Like he did a lot of public speaking. He got a lot of feedback. He was very, in my opinion, very strategic about improving his performance in a way most people don't do. Most people, they just give some speeches and hopefully people applaud at the end. Whereas he approached it the way that, an elite tennis player would approach getting better at their tennis game. And it turns out that when you do that, you get better at public speaking really fast. And so his success was really dramatic. I think it would have been really great even if he hadn't reached the level that he did. But I think, he definitely deserves a lot of credit for taking on this approach. But hopefully it will show other people that by being systematic and intense and aggressive about learning, you can often do better at a lot of things than you thought were possible.
I'm currently trying to start, let me say, my own ultra learning project. Okay. And I completely agree. It's hard to know how to map it out in the beginning. So let's say somebody,
project?
I want to improve at interviewing. I want to get better at doing these interviews.
Okay. All right. Nice.
So I'm kind of struggling to know how I can map it out in the beginning. So let's say for me, how would you start if you wanted to learn how to interview or anything for that matter? How do you start the planning phase? Well, what are your first steps?
So with a skill like that, I think you're going to lean more on, like I would say, leadership, public speaking, any kind of soft skill like that. It's going to lean more on modeling and practice and a little bit less on like theory and concepts. So a couple things I would do. First of all, a key would be to just make sure you've read everything that can be read about interview techniques, because sometimes there's just really obvious ideas that you're missing, right? So I would start by looking at schools of journalism, see if they have any courses on interviewing. I would look at, there's probably quite a few books for media training, how to be a better interviewer, this kind of thing. I think as well, what I would spend a lot of time doing is studying people that I think are really good interviewers. So I like their interviewing style. One that comes to mind, a little bit disgraced now, but Charlie Rose was, in my opinion, probably one of the best interviewers of all time. So I would go through old episodes of Charlie Rose and note what he does well. Note what you want to do. So I think for a soft skill like this, another example is something like writing. Is a lot of it is a personal taste, right? So you need to watch a lot of people who do interviews and ask yourself, what do I like about this? What do I not like about this? So it's not even just objectively, this person's the best interviewer, but what kind of interviewer do I want to be? Do I want to be the kind of person who, gets someone to divulge something personal? So there's interviewers like Oprah is a really good example of that she's able to connect with the guests emotionally and able to kind of bring up maybe something that they wouldn't have wanted to talk about. Other interviewers maybe focus on kind of extracting sort of information. So it's a more, it's less emotive. It's more kind of informational. So figure out what kind of style you like. What do you want to bring out in your interviews? And then the thing I would look at is trying to see how many of those interviewers that you admire could you reach out and contact and ask them about their interviewing. Now, admittedly, when you're dealing with someone like Oprah, she's maybe not going to sit down and tell you her secrets, but you can read books by them so you can kind of figure out hints at their process that way. Or you can just talk to people you think are a little bit better and gather some hints from them as well. And so what I find is really valuable about that is that you get a sense of their process. And when you understand their process, you get a sense of, this is the skill that actually is really important. So I'll give an example. Having not being a great interviewer myself, but having been interviewed many times, one thing I can say is that really like the people who are the best at interviewing do a lot of research. And so that's something that, a lot of people don't want to do. That's just too much work. They just want to ask softball questions. But the people that are the best interviewers, they kind of already know all the stuff you've already said. And so they're able to kind of peel, but this is something you haven't talked about before. And that would be interesting for the interview. So, given that the person listening to this right now is maybe not interested in interviewing skills, how would I generalize that? Well, first, read a lot of books on it and try to create a curriculum from books of the subject skill you want to learn. 2, talk to people who are better than you and that you admire their style for performing that particular skill. Figure out what their process is. And by figuring out their process, you'll see how they conceptualize the skill and what they feel is good about it, right? Is the skill being able to spontaneously leap off someone's question? Is it about being a good listener? Is it about having kind of creating rapport? I was listening to a podcast with Michael Lewis. Actually, I think it was with Malcolm Gladwell talking about Michael Lewis, and he was commenting on how good Michael Lewis is at doing profiles. I'm talking about writing here, but writing these really, really great profiles. And Malcolm Gladwell said, well, the thing that he's really good at is that he just spends like a couple weeks with them. But the key, the real difficulty of that skill is that you have to be someone who's likable enough that you can just call someone up and spend weeks with them to write this profile. Whereas a lot of people are just like, no, I don't want this guy just hanging around me for weeks and weeks and weeks. So you have to, so it turns out that the reason he's really good at writing profiles is that Michael Lewis is a really likable, affable guy that people want to hang around. And that, it turns out, is maybe not obvious from the first blush if you were just like, how do I write profiles like this? And so I think this process of deconstructing skills by looking at exemplars, looking at books, can kind of give you a map now. So if you were to create a project, it'd be like, all right, now I got this list of like 15 books that I need to read. And I've got this like archive of 400 interviews that I want to pour over, and I'm going to make notes, and I'm going to maybe use this as my starting point. And then I'm going to do my own interviews and kind of analyze, sort of like listen over them and make edits to what I want to change. Excuse me. A little bit of a cough there. So this is kind of what I would say Tristan was doing, and I think what a lot of people have done successfully with these skills that are kind of nebulous, that are not really like, obviously if you're learning physics, okay, you just go take this class. It's pretty easy. But if you're learning something where I don't even know where to start, that's where I would start.
It's great how you systematically dissect all the different projects and sort of have this things that you do in most of your projects. Like you talk to people that you admire, that you want to gain their skills with a specific skill or in a specific project. You look at different university courses and what they're teaching. It's a very unique way of looking at the problem that prior to reading your book, I just didn't think of it that way.
Well, I think that's one of the, I've been railing on traditional education a little bit, maybe too much in this podcast, but I think schools don't teach you how to learn. They just teach you material. And I think part of that is just a weakness that's built into the system, because if you have all this material you have to teach, then you kind of present it to students all right, now we're learning this, now we're learning this, now we're learning this. And what's missing there is the possibility for the student to maybe pick something else that they want to learn, or make a mistake and learn something you don't think is best for them to learn that they want to spend time learning. But when we get into real life and we have to learn things, that's the situation we're in. And so if you've never had to structure a learning project before, it's often very difficult. You don't know where to start. You don't know how to pursue it. And you don't have a lot of confidence, maybe, that, again, this self-efficacy thing, just the idea of like, oh, I want to get better at this. I don't know how to do that. It can be hard. And I think this is doubly true because while I think reading books and doing stuff like that is very beneficial, a lot of the research shows that it's this kind of structured practice where you practice and you get feedback and then you attempt something a little different. Like, that's where a lot of the actual skill improvement comes in. And so while it is great to read books, if you just stop there, there's a lot of skills that you won't be able to acquire. Like, you're not going to become a good programmer just by reading books about programming. Like, you actually have to write code and do things. But that's true of a lot of other skills that, it's easy to fall into those traps.
Yeah, because you could be listening to this podcast or reading a book, but if you don't actually apply what they're teaching, then you're not doing anything, basically. You're just having this knowledge that you could later use to speak to someone, but if you're not applying it, then what's the use of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's benefit to learning theoretical subjects, but I think if you're trying to learn an actual skill, then yeah, I think there's benefit in understanding how bicycles work, but like understanding a theory of like torque and stuff is just not going to help you ride an actual bicycle that much. So that's why I think it's important to know your goal before you get into it. Like, if the goal was, I want to understand the physics of bicycles, then yeah, great. Like, reading the book is probably not so bad. But if the goal was, I'm trying to win the Tour de France, then like, yeah, obviously starting with a textbook that describes, gyroscopic forces and stuff is not going to really be the way to do it.
And an exercise that you have in your book that really blew my mind. I even went to my cousin. He's like, yo, you have to do this exercise. It was the bicycle one. I couldn't believe.
Yeah, I like that one too.
I didn't know. You tell us to draw a bicycle and how it works. And I'm like, you obviously think, oh yeah, I definitely know how the bicycle works, but I drew it wrong. And then I told my cousin, he's like, bro, are you stupid? Like, I obviously know how the bicycle works, but none of us drew it correctly. Why does that happen?
Well, I think part of the idea here is that we talk about like understanding as if it's sort of like, well, I understand a bicycle or how a bicycle works. But what you really mean to say is that you're familiar with the operation of a bicycle. That's what you really mean when you say, I understand how a bicycle works. But if you've never actually had to, design a bicycle, for instance, or assemble a bicycle, to be familiar with the operation of a bicycle doesn't actually require a lot of knowledge of the inner workings of the bicycle. And this is true for most of the things in our life, like the kind of advanced example I give after the bicycle. Because, some people will get a bicycle right just from visual memory. They've seen enough bicycles that they can draw it correctly. Not everyone, of course, but quite a few people can. Whereas the kind of like the advanced example is, can you draw and explain how a can opener works? Because a can opener is like, again, a very simple device everyone has in their house. And it turns out that, you know that you got to do this and this. Yeah. And people doing video, I'm squeezing the handle and then twisting the little gear thing. But try explaining how it works. If you've not actually like studied it in depth, it's almost impossible. And I'm saying this not just like, oh, everyone's really stupid and that you really don't understand, but to point out this is just a feature of how our minds work, that if you're not forced to actually use that knowledge to explain something, you often have this sense of, I understand this, but you really don't at all. And so when you're learning a lot of subjects, I think having this kind of intuition check, this, well, do I really understand it, in this kind of way where you force yourself to explain it, or you force yourself to draw a picture, or you force yourself to apply it to a situation, you often realize that you don't understand things very well. So the application of this is not just sort of a fun exercise, but is, I used to get these emails, I still do, but I get these emails from students who will say things like, oh, I studied really hard for a test, and I knew everything, but then when I got there, like they asked all these trick questions, and I couldn't answer right. And the real truth is that no, very rarely are professors asking trick questions. Sometimes on a multiple choice test they'll make you think because they don't want it to just be obvious, but very rarely is the professor thinking when they design the exam, I'll get them. They're going to be thinking this, but it's actually this. It's a trick question. No. What they want to ask is just, did you even understand the material? And the sad truth is most of the time the answer is no. And so what you're doing when you do the test and you feel like it's full of trick questions is you're realizing that you had only a very superficial understanding of what was being discussed. There's no deep structure there. There's nothing you can like rely on to be like, oh, this is a new application, or, oh, this is this idea applied in a way where it's not obvious what the answer is. I'd actually have to know the concept to get the right answer. And we fail at a lot of those things. And so I think the idea here is that if you can engage in more of these kinds of self-generated exercises, like the drawing of the bicycle, you not only realize what your gaps are, but you have some hope of filling them. So once you've attempted to draw a bicycle and then you see what the bicycle actually looks like, for the very first time, you feel like, right, okay, of course. Well, of course, the gears attach only to the back wheel. They don't attach to the front wheel, because if they attach to both of them, then one wheel will go forward, one wheel will go back, and you never go anywhere when you try to pedal it. Like, it's little things like this that I think you only realize when you actually attempt to do something like this.
Yeah, it was an amazing exercise, and I really enjoyed the book. I think you did amazing work there. Everybody should go get it. And having studied and applied all these learning techniques, what is one thing about learning that you want people listening to this podcast to take from this?
Oh, wow. One thing about learning. Well, I think rather than focusing on some kind of cognitive science principle or something technical like that, although there's many of those, I think the thing that I would want to leave people with is the idea that whatever you think about yourself as a learner, whatever you think about yourself is like, whether you're good at school, whether you're bad at school, whether you're good at some subjects and not other subjects, just realize that impression is based on a fairly narrow set of prior experiences. And that, I'm not trying to make some bold claim that like everyone's just as smart as everyone else. We could all be Albert Einstein. I'm saying something I think rather obvious and more commonsensical, that just you have a fairly limited set of experiences that you're drawing this on. And so it makes sense to maybe sample some experiences that are outside of the range of things you've done before. Try projects that are different than what you've done before. Try to learn things in a way that maybe you haven't considered before. And so I hope books like mine will give you some examples and ideas that maybe will give you some starting points for suggestions. But I think even if you just start with this idea that like the frontier of possibilities for things you could learn, or even just possibilities for your life, is often really underexplored, that there's a lot of new territory there that you haven't looked at yet, I think gives us a new perspective. Rather than seeing us as, well, I know myself, I have all this life experience, just realize that that's just a drop in the bucket, I think gives a certain sense of really humility as to the idea of like, well, really, there's a lot of things that maybe I could do that I don't know that I could do right now.
And I think that's a beautiful ending note. Thank you so much for coming on, Scott. I really enjoy your book. I really enjoyed this interview, and you've just blown my mind and allowed me to see so many different things about the learning process and how you recommend we should be learning. And it's great.
Thank you.
And I'll let you know how it goes with the Ultra Learning project. I'll love to stay in touch, man.
Yeah, for sure.
If,
Feel free to send me an email. Definitely let me know if you end up setting something up as a project and working on it. I always like to get examples of people. I've had a few podcasts I've actually been on where the person has done a project after we had our chat and told me about it later. So yeah, it's gratifying.